about it.
Okay. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. So this is the Keltner Book Club. And thank you to Noel Hynd for spending his time with us. We're going to focus on his book, The Sputnik Season, 1957, which is a great year if you're a Milwaukee Braves fan, as well as other teams. He really covered the whole pennant race and other things. So he has a slideshow, and then maybe we can have some Q&A. So I'll leave it to you right now, Noel.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Mary and I met in the cheap seats in Baltimore. I don't know how many of you know that, but it was at the SABR meeting last year. And she had this great Ruth Bader Ginsburg t-shirt on. And I kept looking, I think, gosh, you don't see that everywhere. I'm so happy to see like-minded individuals here. So we got talking, and here we are. This is one of the strangest ways I've ever cadged a Zoom invitation, but here we are anyway. Anyway, Milwaukee folks, we're going to talk about the Sputnik season, which is 1957. If you're not old enough to remember it, it was a pretty great year for Milwaukee, both on the baseball field and just generally. Milwaukee put itself on the map in the United States that year in a very, very positive way. I'm from New York City. One reason I got into this book and wrote this book was I was 9 years old that summer, and it was the first baseball season that I could really, really get into, that I followed from day to day. My father had been a true crime writer in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and had always told me, as I was reading about the game, he would frequently tell me all the old stories about how, when he worked in Boston, he covered Ponzi, and he covered Sacco and Vanzetti cases in his first year on the Boston Post. Anyway, he was on an evening paper. They would wrap up and then go out to Braves Field or go out to Fenway and watch the games. And often, since they had press passes, they would go into the locker rooms. Anyway, that sort of gets me started. When I was growing up, Stan Musial and Willie Mays were my favorite players. Musial, just because his greatness and his quality as a human being seemed to shine through. Mays, I was always sort of a contrarian, and everybody else I knew was a Yankee fan or a Dodgers fan, and they were always talking about Mantle and Snyder. Naturally, I had to go with the third team, which of course was solidly in sixth place for most of my the time I rooted for them. Anyway, 57 season began on Monday, April 15th, 1957. There's, can you see my cursor as I move it?
Yep.
Yeah. If this is, that's Charlie Dressen, Paul Richards, he was both the manager and the general manager of the Baltimore Orioles that year. He was a catcher for John McGraw. You can see he's a tough cookie. There's Ike. If you look very carefully, there's Richard Nixon lurking right behind Eisenhower, not for the first time. Anyway, the season started mid-April 1957. Ike stayed for the entire game, eating peanuts, drinking hot chocolate. The Orioles outlasted the Senators 7-6, 10 innings. It was 40 degrees. Eisenhower stayed for the whole game. Notice he's sitting next to Nixon, but he's talking past Nixon. I'm not sure who that is. Ike outlasted the Germans and the Russians also, so sitting through a Senators game really wasn't that awful. He had company. Richard Nixon was legitimately a pretty big baseball fan. Nixon frequently went out to see the Senators that year with his daughter Tricia. As you could see, they took the game very, very seriously. Anyway, 57, as I said, was the first season I remember from start to finish. A lot of weird stuff happened this year, but we're going to wander through it in the next few minutes. My favorite player was Stan Musial, as I mentioned. Take a look here. Early in his career, he's wearing number 19 before he got to the number 6. Let's go on to another player who wore a different number, just like Mantle wore number 6 before he wore number 7. And Henry Aaron, some of you might have known this, wore number 5 before he made 44 famous. 57 was the final year for the Giants and the Dodgers in New York. The stories about them moving dominated the New York papers the entire year. People were talking about, would they really do it? Was it a bluff? Would the city come up with a new ballpark for them? I think we all know what the answer to that was. But these were not the 1951 New York Giants. And they were not even the 1954 New York Giants. Really, obviously, Monty Irvin, Whitey Lockman, forget who these were, but let's go on. That's these are the Giants of Jackie Brandt, Foster Castleman, Joe Marginieri, I believe that is not Ruben Gomez. I think that's Ossie Virgil. Might be wrong on that. More Giants. That is the previous one. I think might have been Raymond Montant. Anyway, that is Ruben Gomez. And here is Jackie Robinson after he got traded to the Giants at the end of the 1956 season, hoisting a New York Giants pennant. Within another 30 days, he had decided to take a job with the Chock full of Nuts Coffee Company, which was going to pay him better, and he just couldn't really go over to the enemy. My point is, the Giants were aging badly, so was their field. The Dodgers still had members of a recent championship team on the field. In fact, the Brooklyn Dodgers were the defending champions in 1956, but the skills were trading on the field. Robinson was gone. There were a lot of teams in turmoil in the National League, which actually made it a very even competition on that side. Here's a interesting picture. These are 5 guys. Notice the Cardinals uniform. This was the brainstorm of Frank Lane, much disliked general manager by both fans and players. These are players who came over from the Giants to the Cardinals in mid-season 1956, I guess it was. Yeah, right at the trading deadline. I believe that's Whitey Lockman, that's Al Dark, Bob Sarney, and Don Liddell. Liddell best remembered for having thrown the pitch to Vic Wertz, which Willie Mays caught close to 500 feet from home plate. There's another key Cardinal who was going to figure into several Cardinals figured into the 57 pennant race. One of my other favorite players, aside from Musial on the right, was Red Schoendienst, who started the 56 season with the Cardinals, went over to the Giants in midseason, was never happy there. We got back to that in a moment. The Giants did have some fine players. Johnny Antonelli, who of course was with the Braves when they were in Boston and very, very briefly in Milwaukee, was later traded, I believe, for Bobby Thompson. Mays, of course, was one of the fan favorites in New York. It transcended the Yankee fandom and the Dodger fandom. It's another shot of the Polo Grounds as it looked toward the end. That's probably a pretty big crowd for what they were drawing. I believe they averaged about 6,000 people a game in the final season. The ugly truth of the matter is a lot of people were afraid to go to the ballpark. There've been so many bad stories about the neighborhood in West Harlem where the Giants played. I went a couple of times with my father in 56 and 57. We never had a problem, but the perception of white suburbanites was it was a dangerous place to go to. Yankee Stadium, not dangerous at all. It was a very, very stable, older Jewish neighborhood in the Bronx. You could go out you could walk to the ballpark. And of course, the enforcement of discipline within Yankee Stadium was much more strict than at Ebbets Field or at the Polo Grounds. One of the great things about the '57 season was the opportunity,
Apparently
not that you
here,
realized it
almost zero. I tested
at
it
the
before.
time, was to see so many Hall of Famers. I'm going to run through a few of them. Here's one that you would never think of, but he was a pitcher for the, there were 400 spots in Major League rosters, and close to 50 of them were people who landed in the Hall of Fame. Lasorda had a brief walk-on with the A's in 56, but his card, I think, was still issued in 1957. Other Hall of Famers. Some of the 1957 Dodgers, Gil Hodges. If you turn the TV on in New York, this is the team you got to see. That's Hodges, Robinson, Pee Wee Reese, and Roy Campanella. More Hall of Famers in their prime: Al Kaline, the Tigers, Frank Robinson, who frequently would lead the league in being hit by pitches. If you went to a Reds-Dodgers game and Drysdale was pitching, you could just about count on Robinson being hit by a pitch. Roberto Clemente becoming a star in Pittsburgh. Ernie Banks of the Cubs. One of the things that you might subtly notice is how the National League, which was faster to integrate, had come up and promoted the Black Stars. That doesn't mean they were being treated as equally as they should have been, but nonetheless, they were there. And the National League was quickly becoming the more powerful league. However, here is, I guess, at the All-Star game that year, Aaron, Williams, Musial, and Mays, more than 2,300 home runs among them. There was also, excuse me for 1 second, I'm going to try to get rid of my side screen there. There was a young left-handed pitcher in baseball. Let's go back to that one. In 1957, a New York kid with a fastball that begged comparison to Bob Feller. If you were thinking about Sandy Koufax, you were right. But notice those headlines he was getting as a kid. Actually, that's later on, because that's a World Series later on. I'm talking about Herb Score, who was with the Indians that time. The White Sox and the Yankees were fighting for first place in the American League as the season began. But in early May of 1957, in a game against the Yankees, Score was pitching and suffered one of the worst injuries that's ever happened on a baseball field during the game. He was hit squarely in the face with a line drive off the bat of Gil McDougall. It was one of those horrible things where people in the far reaches of the grandstand could actually hear the impact of the ball hitting him in the face. He went down as if he'd been shot. He was nearly killed and removed. He stayed on the field for a few minutes. There were 5 doctors in attendance, finally went off on a stretcher, miraculously survived. But as you know, was never the same again. Did make his mark as a professional in the broadcast booth for many years. A little more than a week later, with the Yankees still struggling in the American League race, this guy had a birthday. That's Billy Martin as a Yankee, as he looked around 1953, 1954. The birthday party, which you probably remains infamous to this day, he chose to celebrate it with teammates at the Copacabana in New York. The Copa was silently owned by a fellow named Frank Costello, who was best known to many Americans for the testifying or evading testimony in the Kefauver hearings on organized crime. But the Copa was still a lively place to go. The place had great entertainment. That's Martin and Lewis, I believe, dumping champagne on Danny Thomas. Not sure who that is back there, but it was a place that athletes like to go to be seen, to party. It had great eye candy in addition to performers. The Copa girls would come out and entertain people before the acts. The shorts were made of blue mink, by the way, valued at $200 a pair. You just don't see that every day. The show that the Yankees, here's the Yankees birthday party. You'll see Yogi, Mickey, Johnny Cooks, Billy Martin, Hank Bauer, who was former Marine who served in the Pacific, was there also. The Yankees were there to see Sammy Davis Jr., but they couldn't hear the show because a bunch of loudmouth drunks, a bowling team from the Bronx, had come in late, disrupted the show. Davis tried to continue. Then they started to make racial taunts at Sammy. I have the quotes. I'm not going to repeat them. It was pretty ugly, however. Bauer told the guys to shut up. One of them, in a monumental move of stupidity, challenged Bauer to a fight, maybe without realizing who he was, or maybe some to prove how tough he was. One thing led to another. The guys went downstairs to the men's room, and before you knew it, the bowler was on the floor clutching his face. Now, the Yankee management at the time tried to be very, tried to present a very squeaky clean image of their players to New York and to the American public. So they didn't want something like this on the front page of the newspapers the next day. Here's Bauer. Here's the guy who allegedly Bauer slugged. And it was right there on the front page. Eventually, there was charges, criminal charges were filed against Bauer, and several of the Yankees had to come into court. Mantle testified. Mantle came in chewing gum, and the judge told him to put the gum away, so he put it under his chair, like a high school kid might. Barra's testimony was basically nobody done nothing to nobody, and Mantle testified that he was too drunk to remember anything. Flashing forward many, many years, a couple of years ago, a gentleman who was known at the time as Joey at the Copa came forward and said that Bauer never hit him. It was one of the security guys who cold cocked the guy in the men's washroom. Whatever, Bauer was acquitted, but the victim of all the shenanigans at the party was Billy Martin, because Martin was there. The Yankees, the upper management did not like Martin. Casey loved him, but he soon, as you can see, was wearing a different uniform. Exile in the Midwest to Kansas City, which is where the Yankees frequently dumped any players that they were trying to get rid of. And also Martin participated in a brawl in Chicago at Comiskey Park shortly before the trading deadline. Let's see what I'm doing here. So here we go. This was part of the brawl in Chicago. That's Enos Slaughter. Took 30 minutes. It started off with what was alleged to be some racial discussion at home plate between, I believe, Larry Doby and Art Ditmar. Anyway, so much for the American League. As the season progressed into June, the Yankees had still not turned on the afterburners. They were still chasing the Chicago White Sox. In the National League, let me give you a shot of spring training in Vero Beach with the Dodgers. Emmett Kelly, Duke Snider, Walter O'Malley, not sure who that is. However, that's the mayor of Los Angeles in February of 1957, checking on his team. If that doesn't signal that O'Malley was going no matter what, it's very hard to find anything clearer than that. Eventually, both of these guys would return. It's Snyder with the Dodgers, obviously Willie Mays. Both later returned for cameos with the Mets. However, the Giants were heavily influencing the pennant race that year because at the trading deadline, they sent Red Schoendienst to Milwaukee. And Milwaukee needed a second baseman. Schoendienst hit well over 300, I believe, or just over 300 for the Braves. He was the cohesion in the infield that was needed. And so when the All-Star break came around, the All-Star game was in St. Louis. The Braves, nonetheless, were still tracing the Cardinals by 2.5 games. And the White Sox were 2.5 games behind the Yankees. These are the guys, though, who were powering the Braves to the upper reaches of the National League's first division. And it was obviously Aaron Matthews hitting and the solid part of the batting order. Joe Adcock was out for part of that year, replaced by Frank Torrey. The unexpected challenge to the Braves came from St. Louis. This is Dizzy Dean on the left. That is a fellow named Vaughn McDaniel in the middle, 18 years old, just a few weeks out of high school. His older brother, Lindy McDaniel, who pitched for many, many years in the in both leagues, originally was a starter, then in 1960 became an excellent reliever with the Cardinals. The McDaniel brothers were seen as the second coming of the Dean brothers. They were everywhere in the media. It was a great story. If anybody was getting more publicity than the Braves were, it was the McDaniels. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. At the, let's go to a different, here we go. National League All-Star game was played in St. Louis. National League won 6-5, but not without controversy. This was the first great ballot stuffing in All-Star game history. This is a copy of how the All-Star ballot looked in the Cincinnati papers, where they basically were telling you to back the local team. Notice they were called the Redlegs because of the Red Scare. The name Reds wasn't used in the mid-1950s. Even if you weren't following baseball, you got the name of the Cincinnati player to fill in. The commissioner had to step in and say that Mays and I think it was Mays and Musial were automatically on the team no matter how the votes turned out. And then he said he had the power to step past the voting. Nonetheless, several Cincinnati players did start the game. A strange footnote to the game, Schoendienst was elected to the squad as a New York Giant, but by the time the game was played, he was a member of the Braves. So he was, here the Cardinals were, the All-Star game was in St. Louis. Here the Cardinals were fighting for the pennant against the Braves, and the guy who was helping move the Braves up the standing was their former second baseman, who was now with Milwaukee. After the game, Red had to go to catch a train to Pittsburgh for his next game. He was caught speeding, and the St. Louis policeman, who was angry that he was not still with the Cardinals, wrote him up for a ticket. He had to come back later on between games and appear in court. Red was not a happy guy on that. Back to Warren Spahn, powering the Braves with the 21 wins that year. So, as I said, the only thing in front of the Braves were the Cardinals, who actually maintained a lead into September. The Cardinals took a strong run at the Braves. Then there was a big series in September against Milwaukee, the Braves in Milwaukee. Don't have to remind you probably who won the key game with an extra inning home run with 1 week to go in the season. That decided the pennant. Now, we're in the mid-50s. There was something else big going on, and it actually has some resonance with recent events here. Before we get to the World Series, the 50s was a time of constant UFO sightings all over the United States. There had been strange sightings in the early 50s over Washington, D.C. That's not a photograph, obviously, but the UFOs just not go away. There was even a ball player, a guy named Ed Mayer, who went 2-2 in 57, 58. Really nice guy. He unfortunately died in 2015. Gone to University of California, Berkeley, became a wonderful teacher in California. Always loved the time he'd been with the Cubs. Even got him in his 70s with his Cubs license plate. When he was in the minor leagues, he said that he had actually seen a flying saucer. I'm going to read you the quote that he gave to a writer a few years before he died. "This is a great incident, and I don't think I'm crazy. I'm not. Believe me, it's been verified by many people. We were in Class B ball or C ball in Georgia in either 1954 or 55. I forget which. It's a night game. I'm in the third base dugout, and we're just watching a guy on the other team warming up. And all of a sudden, this round disc comes over the stadium, silent, about 200 feet up, spinning slowly, red, white, and blue lights. And I said to the guy next to me, 'Do you see what I see?' He said, 'Yeah, holy cow, what is it?' We were just enthralled," Mr. Meyer remembered, "looking at it. And it stayed there silently for 10 or 15 seconds, looking down, obviously, because it was right above the pitcher's mound. And then all of a sudden, it went out of sight in about 3 seconds. No sound, just poof, off like that. And right now today, we don't have the capability of doing what that thing did. That was a UFO. It was absolutely unbelievable. In fact, after it happened, I even went over to the left field corner and asked somebody, 'Did you see that?' And they said, 'Yeah.' Then I went over to the right field corner and they said, 'Yeah, for sure. That's what it was.' So all his life, he was a believer in flying saucers because he saw one in Class B baseball. Meyer gave up 2 home runs at the end of the 57 season as the Cubs limped their way to 7th place. One was to Hank Sauer, the other was to Willie Mays. Parenthetically, before I get back to baseball, Hollywood had a wonderful time with the flying saucers. A whole spate of movies came out. Some of them were very quickly made. This is a poster for Plan B from Outer Space. UFOs were just part of the fabric of discussion in the US in 1956 and 57, which is why I've included it here. If you look carefully, this film was put together so quickly that you can see the shadow of the boom mic overhead. And down here, that's the script on the actor's mouth. On the actor's lap as they proceeded. Anyway, on to the World Series. It was a beautiful one. With some of the greatest players ever. Home game in Milwaukee. What could be more beautiful than a World Series in the daylight, in the sunshine? Look at that beautiful uniform with the number 44. Here's how it looked at Yankee Stadium. That's the first game at Yankee Stadium. I think it's the first inning. This looks like Hank Aaron to me, and I think that's Matthews. These seats cost $7 that year for the World Series. I know because the first World Series that I went to was that year with my father. We sat way down in the left field line. It was game 6. The Yankees were facing elimination, but they won it. Speaking of elimination, this guy did a good job of eliminating the Yankees. Mantle was injured during the series on a play where he collided with Red Schoendienst at second base. Aaron hit .393 with 3 home runs. Spahn won 1 game. Lou Burdett won 17 during the season, 3 more, including 2 shutouts. The late Tim McCarver, Burdett frequently denied that he threw a spitball. And one time when he denied it publicly, Burdett later pitched for the Cardinals in '64. McCarver was his catcher. And McCarver on TV said, I don't know why Lou says he didn't throw the pitch. When I caught him with the Cardinals, we had an actual sign for it. Nonetheless, there he is again, and we know the result, particularly in Milwaukee, and the way it was termed there. Bushville wins. Frankly, I just loved the Braves so much that year that I was very happy to see the Yankees lose. If you look at the series historically, by the way, one of the things I put forth in my book is the theory that the '57 season changed a lot in baseball. First of all, it removed 2 teams from New York. It shifted the geographics of the game all the way to the West Coast, but more subtly, the Yankees lost in '57. The Yankees won in '56. The Yankees didn't get to the pennant in '54, and they lost in '55. You can see how the great Yankee dynasty of the '50s was starting to crumble, was starting to come apart. They were still a powerful team, but it was not the way it had been. But why is it the Sputnik season? First of all, in the middle of the World Series, the first satellite was launched, October 4th, 1957, on a travel date between games 2 and 3 of the World Series. It opened the space age, it opened the space race. It caused shock and surprise and alarm in Washington and an awful lot of displeasure. But there's another reason also that I named this the Sputnik season, and here it is. The original meaning of Sputnik in Russian meant co-traveler or fellow traveler. Draw your own conclusions. These 2 fellow travelers, that's Walter O'Malley and Horace Stoneham, beat it out of town, taking their ball clubs with them. Was it a big story? You bet it was. Baseball in the world would never be the same. And when Sputnik was reported on its way down, this is from the New York Daily News in New York, the same day that Sputnik was reported to be crashing back to Earth, the Dodgers made the final announcement that they were going to Los Angeles. It took second billing to Sputnik, and that was the end of the season. As a kid, I remember you could barely believe it. You just thought that when spring would come, the Polo Grounds, Ebbets Field would be open again, and the teams would be there. But no, you started to see the teams as they were televised from places. In New York, you would start to see the teams when they were televised from Philadelphia, and the Giants had that strange SF on the cap, and the Dodgers had the strange LA on the cap. And that's the season. 6 months with some crazy, wonderful stuff all wrapped up into however long I talk, 30 minutes or so. So thank you for listening. And any questions, we can talk more about it right now.
No, thank you that was an excellent slideshow.
You're very welcome. Believe me, I could have put together several hundred for the season. There were no hitters, there were triple plays. One can only do so much, even this from the author of a 630-page book on the Giants. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, just more incentive for people to read the book. It's very entertaining, So, yeah, the Copacabana story, and even like all the stuff about old New York, Danny's Hideaway, where they used to hang out, and the details in that. And I love the color photos of the World Series. Those are fantastic.
Yeah, one of those was a Sports Illustrated photo, and the one that I used for the cover of the book, that was just taken by somebody with a Kodak camera. That's why it's a little fuzzy. I tried to research the copyright on it, and I couldn't find anything. I used it, and I haven't heard from anybody. It's very hard to track down photo credits because a lot of things weren't copyrighted at the time. Writers would go out, or photographers would go out, they go to the ballpark, they take 100 pictures, and then they do it again the next day. So unless something was used, it wasn't copyrighted. And then the question arises, who owns the copyright? The newspaper, which probably doesn't exist anymore, or the actual writer who's probably, the photographer who's not alive anymore. So, yeah, photos.
So I have plenty of questions for you, but I'd love to hear anybody's comments. We have, I know a few of our participants have fond memories of the 1957 season, including Bob Beege, who contributed. He has a very small but mighty contribution to your book that's wonderful about attending with his father. But would anybody like to comment on
real
the
quick,
book or the
Ryan,
season?
real quick, Mary Ryan's got a comment out here in the chat. In 1953, KC owner Arnold Johnson bought Yankee Stadium. Until his death in 1960, the Yankees pretty much used them as a farm team.
Yeah, absolutely. I go into this in the book, and it was more complicated than I can actually, recall right now. But apparently, there was something like 50 different deals from the time that the A's came in from Kansas City until into the 1960s. Huge names, Roger Maris. The links went even deeper than that because, of course, Stengel had managed in Kansas City. Berra had played in Kansas City. Ford had played in Kansas City. And Mantle, if I didn't say that, had played in Kansas City. The Kansas City manager, I forget who it was, but he was former in the minor leagues, was a former Yankee who was shaping people to become the Yankees of the future. It was really the Yankees AAA team that was moved into the bottom rung of the American League.
George Selkirk, I believe.
I'm sorry?
I believe it was George Selkirk.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. I have it in the book, but I haven't memorized the book or read it recently. You would never get away with that today. I can't even draw an analogy. Anyway, yeah, and one year when the Yankees won the pennant, it might have been 56, they played Kansas City 22 times and they won 21 of the games. And I can remember I liked listening to Yankee baseball at Kansas City because it started after I was supposed to go to bed. So I put the transistor radio under my pillow, like almost everybody of my age did, and listen. And the game started at 10 minutes of 10 or something, because it was in it was the farthest team west in the major leagues as of 1957. That obviously changed in 58. More?
So we have a couple. We have a couple of questions from Dave Clement. He said, "What memories did you have from the Giants and Dodgers that year? Were you 5 or 9?"
I was 9.
9. And were you as interested in the Yankees or later the Mets?
I eventually became a Met fan, and eventually after that became a Yankees fan during when I lived in New York toward the late 70s. It took me a long time to come around on the Yankees because there was just nothing exciting it seemed to me. The National League was the exciting league. You had brawls. Look, even in the 57, one thing I've neglected to mention, the 57 pennant race was so wide open that at the All-Star break, the Dodgers were in fifth place, and they were 5 games behind. So going into the halfway mark of the season, anybody could have won that pennant that year. The Braves won because they just had the better team and the deeper roster. The first game I ever went to was at the Polo Grounds. As I mentioned earlier, I really liked Stan Musial. So, and my dad preferred to go to the Polo Grounds than Ebbets Field or Yankee Stadium. So it was an annual event. We'd go in for a game or two to see the Cardinals play the Giants. The first time we went, it rained like hell. So I had the thrill of seeing the tarp put on the field 2 or 3 times. I can still remember, though, the Musial homered, and Cardinals won 5-4. The next year we went to, it was a nice day in June. The Polo Ground, I couldn't believe how green it was. And one thing you could barely believe was just, you look towards center field and it just seemed to go on forever. Over the top, I don't know whether you can see it here, I'm circling my background. If you sat in the second deck, there were only 2 decks in the Polo Grounds like this. If you sat behind home plate, you could actually see Yankee Stadium in the South Bronx. It was about 2 miles away. On a clear day, it was quite visible. One thing I remember most about the 1957 game is I also, like most 10-year-old kids, liked professional wrestling. And I look a few box seats away, and there's a guy who wrestled under the name of Johnny Valentine with his son, who was probably about my age at the time, who years later became a wrestler also. And I said to my father, "Do you know who that is?" "Who?" And I said, "Johnny Valentine." He had no idea. He didn't watch the wrestling. Thought it was fixed. Imagine that. But he did explain to me that one of the things about the Polo Grounds and Yankee Stadium is you would see famous people just kind of being themselves, taking in a ball game. So I think that addressed both questions. That's my memories of the Polo Grounds, and also, yeah, later I switched over to the Mets.
And where did you grow up in New York?
I was born in a place that doesn't exist anymore. I was born at, my father was a pretty successful writer in his day, and he lived at 61st and Park Avenue. And I was born, yeah, right, the slums. That's the only way I could get to that address. I was born there. But I was born around the corner at a hospital called Wickersham Hospital. And it later became it was later torn down and became where Alexander's department store was. It was right next to Bloomingdale's. So even though I don't think I sound like it, I'm actually a native New Yorker. I was born like 2 miles or 1 mile from Times Square. But I grew up actually in Connecticut. My father had had enough of the city. I mentioned my father was a crime writer there. First, he had been kidnapped in the late 40s, and then there were at least one attempt on his life in the early 50s. So he decided that Connecticut might be a little bit safer. And so we moved up to Fairfield, Connecticut. So that's where I grew up. Then later on, I moved back to New York.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. Well, definitely an influence on you.
Yeah. He was actually, there was yet another attempt on his life in 1952, which I can actually remember. He was poisoned as a result of his investigation into a murder case called the Harry Oakes case, which took place in the Bahamas during World War II. And my father wrote an expose on it and just stated the facts. And they pointed to several people who were very powerful in the Bahamas. And somehow living into Connecticut, a poison got into his system that was endemic to the Bahamas. So somebody either broke into our house and planted it in the kitchen, or somebody slipped it to him where he used to hang out at the Algonquin Hotel in New York. It was one of the two places. He was, my mother told, the doctors told my mother he would not survive. He was in an oxygen tent. Somehow he survived it, but my older sister, who just passed away this past year, used to say he was never quite the same after that. And I do know how it meant. So Connecticut turned out to be more dangerous than New York. So what can you say?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear about your sister. But yeah, I don't know if I mentioned to everyone that you write a number of spy thrillers, and also you contributed to Sports Illustrated. You've had quite a career, but definitely influenced by your father, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of from stories like that, I discovered that writing fiction is a whole lot safer than reporting on true crime. So I thought, it's not a bad way to make a living if you can do it. But this thing where people come around to get even or exact their opinion on you, I could do without. I can remember people who were just out of prison calling. They'd cadged his number from his magazines. I remember he asked me to listen in a couple of times, and there were some rather rough-hewn characters on the phone. Well, a couple of times they came over. He invited this guy over who was a member of the Bridgeport, Connecticut Mafia, and we're having dinner. My mother was just horrified of this. We're having dinner, and the guy was a card shark and a poker cheat. And he looks at me and says, "You want to see how to cheat at cards?" I said, "Sure." So he's got a deck or two on him. So he's teaching me how to deal off the bottom of the deck, and this little click that you listen for if somebody's dealing from the bottom. And so he's dealing, and he says, "When do you want to see the Queen of Hearts?" And I said, "Now." And out it comes, face up. Yeah, it was an education.
Yeah, we'll stick with the fiction. Yeah, true crime is so popular now, but yeah, maybe, there's ramifications to that. So anyways, I'll mention a couple of other comments. Dave Clement also mentioned about Ryan Duran also moved from the Athletics to the Yankees. Ryan Duran is another topic that's just really interesting.
Yeah. Ryan Duran passed away a few years ago. He was apparently legally blind and had a breathtaking or death-defying fastball, and it frequently would not go over the plate. And Casey Stengel let it be known around the league that he often would take a few pops of booze before coming into pitch. So he was really one of the most intimidating pitchers of the era. Casey was, Duran had beaten the Yankees as a Kansas City starter, I think in '56. And Kansas City had kind of had enough of him. So they threw him into, I might have been the Billy Martin trade. Casey decided he would just use him in selected situations where he could come in and get the side out, have people ducking for 3 or 4 batters. And it worked. I believe Duran was in the series in I think he was on the roster in 57 and 58, maybe just 58. I think he was on the roster in 60 against the Pirates. And then I believe in the expansion after the 60 season, he went to the Angels. But he had a pretty good career as a reliever, but was rather a troubled individual at the time. That stuff like that didn't get in the press that much. It was sort of photographers who've come along, SABR people who've come along after the fact and interviewed people afterwards, and brought out the full and to some degree more human story.
Interesting. I remind people, you check the chat. Ryan is putting in some good nuggets into the chat. You can put questions in the chat, or just let us know if you have any questions or comments about the 57 series, season. Anyone want to weigh in?
I'll ask a question. Noel, I know you wrote a book about it and stuff, but what are your favorite things about the Polo Grounds? Like, what do you remember the most going there?
I was fascinated and remain fascinated by the really weird shape of it. I mean, it was, other people have used this analogy, but it was shaped like an old-fashioned bathtub. It would just keep going and going to center field. And those foul lines, it was like 257 down one and 273 or 79 down the other. I had one of the articles I wrote for Sports Illustrated had to do with Matty Schwab and his family, who was Matty was the groundskeeper at the Polo Grounds for many years into the 50s. And New York being New York, housing was very difficult near the ballpark. And so Horace Stoneham opened up an area under the left field stands, and that became the apartment for the Schwab family. And I can't look at that ballpark without remembering that. I had the pleasure of talking both to Matty in the 1980s before he died, and also his son Jerry. And Jerry took the kids would take batting practice after the players were done. They would run around the fields at night. They could play games at night when the lights were still on after the field was taken care of. There were apparently tunnels under the Polo Grounds where you could go down in left field under a tunnel and then pop up through the turf out in right field or something. Imagine growing up like that in a venue like that. I mean, that just sounds like a dream to me. I think Matty used to have a phrase that when he was talking about Bobby Thompson's home run, he said, "Bobby Thompson's home run landed on my roof," because the apartment of the family was right under those stands. Mrs. Schwab hated it on game days because it always sounded like there was an earthquake going on upstairs. But it was, all the old ballparks had so many quirks. I knew a friend of mine was a sports writer for the Bulletin and Inquirer in Philadelphia for many years. And he used to tell me these, how in Connie Mack's days, if you were a seminarian, you could get into an A's game free. Just wear your religious clothing. So he had an older cousin who was in fact a seminarian, and everybody was always borrowing the cassocks or whatever you call them to go to an A's game, and people just winked at it. Peter Golenbach's book about the bums about the Dodgers goes into all the quirks with Ebbets Field. The public address announcer Tex Rickard, who one time Preacher Rowe left the game and they had to make an announcement. So he says, "Preacher left the game because he don't feel good." You just don't get that anymore. And I know it's different age, but we've lost something, and that's kind of why I'm so attracted to writing about the old ballparks, the old eras, the Giants when they were in New York, Ebbets Field. Going back to Jerry Schwab for a moment, he later moved to San Francisco with his father. And if you remember the sand trap game, one of the playoff games in '61, there was a guy out there with a hose watering down the base paths and the outfield because the Dodgers would steal every base that they could. That was Jerry with the hose. And he got chewed out by the umpires, and his father comes over and says, "I don't know this guy, he's a new man, go back to the dugout." So then they had to put sand in the areas that they flooded with water, and they were just laughing because the sand would slow down the Dodgers even more. And I said, "Do you feel any kind of guilt about that?" He says, "No, the Dodgers had a steamroller in that area. It was out in the outfield, and they would go over the outfield grass so that when their line drive hitters like Maury Wills, Tommy Davis, Willie Davis would hit line drives into the outfield. The things would skid. It'd be like hitting concrete with the flattened grass, and it would go to the wall. So everybody did it. It wasn't injecting yourself with something. It was just playing with your home field, and you got to get away with it generally. I talked forever. I don't know what your original question was.
Well,
Memories
there's a
of the
great
Polo
story.
Grounds.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, but the history is more compelling because of the quirkiness and the old stories. And yeah, so Peter Cottrell has his hand up. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I was raised as a fan of the expansion Washington Senators, and so I've had to deal with the trauma of a team being ripped out from under you. But with the Senators, a little different. The American League owners didn't vote for them to leave until September 21st, and there was suddenly the teams leaving town, and the last game ends in a riot. But I have the impression that in New York in '57 it was a lot different. They kind of just went out with a whimper. So can you talk about that and that contrast?
Well, let's talk about the Dodgers first because it's easier. O'Malley didn't make the official announcement, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, until after the season is over. So he really just allowed the Dodgers season to end with a whimper. They were sort of within shot of the pennant up until around Labor Day, and then there weren't enough games to get back into the race. So attendance declined for the last games at Ebbets Field. I think only 6,700 people turned up for the final game. It was sort of a chilly, humid night. Polo Grounds was completely different because Stoneham had announced in May the Giants were leaving, and the fans were angry. And one of my best sources on this was a gentleman named Eddie Logan, who lives in Arizona now, who was the bat boy for the Giants in their final season. His father was, I believe, the clubhouse manager for the team. Strangely enough, there was more anger aimed at the Giants because it was really more tactile. They were there. The final game was played. Everybody knew it was the final game. And basically the Polo Grounds was ripped up and vandalized. Bill Rigney, and you could feel it coming in the dugout. Eddie told me that Bill Rigney said to Willie Mays, never mind your hat, never mind your glove. When this game is over, run for your life, save your life. These people are beyond angry. They were incensed. They were, I can't even describe it. They were homicidal. Somebody could have actually gotten killed that day. Eddie was like 16, 17 years old at the time. And I think it was the trainer said, don't worry about your hat. Stay with me. Just stay right next to me and run like hell. Rigney, who knew what was coming, put Raymond Monzant, I think, on the mound to pitch the final inning. Why? He was the fastest guy on the team. So the theory was that depending what the final play was, he could be the farthest one from the dugout. So he would, streak like hell. People were furious. The place got torn up. There was this wonderful monument to Eddie Grant in center field, which was torn off. Nobody ever saw it again. People have searched for it for years. Eddie Grant being the one-time member of the Giants who was killed in World War I on a military expedition looking for a group of soldiers called the Lost Battalion. It's a long story unto itself. It's in my Giants of the Polo Grounds book. Anything that could be carted away it was very sad. Christy Mathewson's widow wouldn't even go to the game. Mrs. McGraw did as a guest of the Giants. Officially, she and Bill Rigney were the last people to leave the ballpark. Unofficially, of course, there were people who worked there, but they were more sort of, they were the final people who really had professional links to the team on the field. Did I answer your question, or did I talk all over the place? I just, Peter, a very good friend of mine who passed away a couple of years ago was a Senators fan in the 60s. And believe me, he and I used to commiserate when we were in boarding school together, because particularly in 65, when the Twins won the pennant, because he said, these are all the guys I grew up with, Killebrew, Cott, these were the Washington Senators. As soon as the team got good, they took them away from me and replaced them with an expansion team, as you know.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, you mentioned Blanche McGraw. I thought the description of the last game at the Polo Grounds was really poignant. You know, the last New York Giants game.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have liked to have hung out with Blanche McGraw, John McGraw's wife, of course.
She was quite a lady. And I think I mentioned in one of the books, people for years would send her, you know, is there a way I could get John's autograph? And she had saved all of the checks he signed, and would cut the name, cut the signature off. I never met anybody who actually knew her. I used to see her at games. She was always sitting in the same seat. She had a lifetime pass. And she was, if you really thought about it, she was really a living link for so many years, who went all the way back to 1903, when McGraw came from Baltimore to New York. I had during one of my Sports Illustrated articles, I had to call Carl Hubble, the great pitchers of the 30s, who played for McGraw. And Mr. Hubble did not have that many kind words for Mr. McGraw, although he did admit he was an excellent manager. Personally, you didn't want anything to do with him. I always remember he said, Hubble said, he wasn't just called the Little Napoleon, he was the Little Napoleon. And you couldn't deal with him. You did what he did, or you weren't on the team anymore. Hubble got away with a lot because he was a winning pitcher for the Giants. He also, the back end of his career went into the Bill Terry era also. But again, Mrs. McGraw went all the way back to 1903. She wrote a book with a ghostwriter, I guess it was in the 1950s. And you can tell it's sort of been, it's been softened up quite a bit. But some of the things that whoever the writer was put into her voice were very, very poignant and very interesting. And just how much, I mean, it's a cliche, but how much the city has changed, how much baseball has changed in 120 years. You know, when I was a kid, I would read about the 1905 World Series and think, wow, 50 years ago, that seems such a long time. Now, I can, the book I wrote was about a season from 67 years ago. You do the math on that, you can see how old I am. But it's fascinating stuff, and it's so nice to get to move the conversation to SABR. It's so nice to go to these conventions and see and talk to people who really respect history and the history of baseball. I find most SABR people who I run into are pretty good historians in their own right. They know an awful lot about the world wars and things. It's refreshing when you consider how much ignorance is out there, that, you know, people don't know stuff that happened 10 years ago. Anyway, I'll on to the next question.
Yeah, no, the continuity of baseball is incredible. Yeah, I think we can all relate to that. So we've got a couple of other comments. Dennis has reminded me that we should do the drawing for the book. So we send a copy of your book to a lucky winner who hasn't, some people have read the book. you can let us know if you've read the book. Otherwise, Dennis, do you want to take care of that?
Yep, I'd be glad to. I've only made it halfway through the book, and now you ruined the book for me. Now you tell me the Braves win the World Series and the Dodgers and Giants left. Oh, wow, it's the mystery's gone.
Well, Hamlet gets killed at the end of the play too. So there's my.
What? That was my. Oh man. I enjoyed the book because of the stories. You're a storyteller in your other books, and I was not reading this as a history book. I was reading it as a storybook. You were telling stories, and that's what makes it was the stories in the book that really made it so interesting. So after I do the drawing, I have a question for you. Is there a favorite story from the book that you would like to relate?
From the Giants at the Polo Grounds.
From this book, from the Sputnik book, is there any story that you can think of that you would like to relate? Tell us about. Before you do that, let me do this drawing. I have a name coming out of here. If I can show this, Jack. No, this is, I don't know where my camera is. Oh, you can't probably see. Congratulations, Jack.
Great.
Yeah.
I will
Back
send.
from Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah, I will send this down. I will order it and send it to you. So thank you very much. Okay.
Congratulations, Jack. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. First time
Hope you
winner.
enjoy it.
Jack, you're so lucky. I wish I'd never read it so I could enjoy reading it for the first time. So
Yeah.
it might take you several years at 630 pages, but go ahead.
Oh, the Polo Grounds book is big. The Sputnik book isn't that bad.
No,
I shouldn't say bad, but 359 with photos.
Most of my spy novels are 400 and some. I can't shut up. What can I tell you?
Yeah, they're page turners.
Favorite story. I don't know. So many of them are so complicated. I don't want to shortchange any of them. But one of the ones that I came across was at the beginning of the Sputnik season. There was a couple of weird plays where involving the Cincinnati Redlegs, where I forget the player, it might have been Don Hoke, would be on second base or first base, and somebody would hit a ground ball that was going to be an easy double play ball. And he, as the base runner, would then field the ball and flip it to an infielder. And the rule at the time was if there was contact between a batted ball and a base runner, the base runner was out, but the runner reached first base. It wasn't considered interfering with a double play. And the commissioner changed the rule by ukase, like 1 month into the season, because he kept doing that in games and the other players would sort of be standing around saying, well, what's going on with this? Like most, the baseball is just filled with, could you imagine somebody doing that today? It just wouldn't happen. As a quick story, that's the that's the one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another one though, very quickly. Through my father, I had the pleasure to meet a fellow named Lee Allen, who was the historian at the Baseball Hall of Fame for many years. And Lee had witnessed some kind of crime and wanted my father's advice as to what to do about it in terms of selling it as a story. And my father quickly focused in on the fact that there was no resolution to the crime. So it was like asking a riddle and not having the answer. But after Mr. Allen sat there knocking off a very good part of a bottle of bourbon before he left. And I finally had a chance to talk a little baseball with him, and I was impressed because he knew so many people. So I asked about the stories that I had heard through my father and other people about Ty Cobb and what a dislikable individual he was. And Alan looks at me and says, Ty Cobb was a first-class son of a bitch, and he still remains so to this day. And I said, what about Rogers Hornsby? And he said, every bit as bad, just a first-class bastard. And I said, gosh, you know them? Yeah, I know them. I wish I didn't. He says, and I asked him about Musial, and he said, that Musial's a good guy, but he's boring. You know, I'd rather hang out with Rube Marquardt who'd be shooting marbles with kids and things like that. So the revisionist theories on Ty Cobb, I don't really buy. I haven't read the new books about them, but man, all of the old time reporters had horrible stories about Cobb, and not much better ones about Hornsby. Apparently, when Hornsby was in the Texas League, I think as a manager, his mother died, and the owner of the team, somebody comes to him and says, do you want to take a train back home for the funeral? And essentially, the story I got, if you don't mind my language, was Hornsby said, fuck that, I'm supposed to be here with the team. I'm going to stay here with the team. Well, your mom's funeral, you're walking on that one. Okay. There you go. Lee Allen also said that he thought the real reason the Giants and I've put this in one of the books, the real reason the Giants and Dodgers left New York was, quote, management could not guarantee their season's ticket holders protection against armed robberies in the box seats. And that has always stayed with me. And that was part of it was never in the press so succinctly in the 1950s, but people were afraid to go to those ballparks. And it was sort of a whispering campaign. Oh, he's going to go. So it's not a coincidence. My father took me to Saturday day games to stay out of the neighborhood at night. So make of it what you will. I visited the park, and I visited the park when the Mets were there. I never had a problem with anything. So I did mug a few people as I was leaving the park, but that's anyway.
You were the problem.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Nasty Noel.
Yeah. So let's see. Ryan Shore says Arthur Mann was the sports writer. Are you talking about the writer who wrote Blanche McGraw's book? I think that may be what he's referring to. Ryan also said before game one of the 1962 playoff, that was a sand trap game. I think you were talking about how they mow down, harden the field. So, and then Peter, I think Peter had to leave, but he said, Peter Barbella said, many say Bobby Thompson's Shepherd Around the World wouldn't have been a home run in any other park. So I think a lot of us kind of know that.
Well, yeah, but the pitch might have been a different pitch in another park too.
Sure. Exactly.
Thompson also hit a home run, I believe, also to left field in one of the games at Ebbets Field, and it was a much longer shot then. So who's to say?
Yeah. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Okay. Anything you'd like to, so are you going to be at SABR in Chicago, you and Patricia?
I'm hoping that we are. I was just looking at the airfare and airline costs and had a little bit of sticker shock.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff to do in Chicago, and it's always fun to hang out with SABR people. So I'm leaning toward it right now. I've never been to Chicago other than to go from O'Hare to Midway on a snowy day. Yeah.
It's a fabulous city. It really is.
I know that.
Yeah.
I know that. So I'm leaning toward it. There's always the Art Institute of Chicago in case the SABR panels cloud over or something. I've never.
Yeah, there's so much right near the convention. Yeah. The Art Institute is right there.
You're going, I assume.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's easy for me. I can just take the train for 90 minutes, and
Yeah.
Well,
so
I wish. Trains
Yeah.
a little longer from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
We may
All
also be looking at doing something here in Milwaukee just before the convention. The Cubs will be in town here and possibly doing like a tailgate party. I want to see if we can arrange it through SABR so that they can give us some marketing on that or something to see if we can, people coming into Chicago who may want to see the Cubs won't have that opportunity. They can come up and see a ball game in our ballpark and visit us and then go to the convention. So we're going to work on an idea there. Haven't put it together yet, but it's something we're working on.
Tell me honestly, is the beer better in Milwaukee than Chicago?
Is the what?
Is the beer better in Milwaukee than Chicago?
You know what? I go to Wrigley a lot, and the beer is much better at Miller Park than
Yeah.
Wrigley. But
It's-
Sox Park is okay for beer. Wrigley, it's Budweiser products. So
Yeah,
um,
so I thought.
yeah,
I've-
that's just
I've-
my opinion.
No, we're going to Sox Park too, so that'll help, or whatever they call
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
I like Sox Park.
I've heard beer stories about those houses across the street and the seating on the roof from Wrigley. I'm not sure that I'm really ready for that, but again, I love to add new parks to my career list. I can't really lose on a trip to Chicago. Who are they going to have as guests this year? Former players? Anybody have any idea?
I don't know.
Okay.
Does anybody know?
Haven't seen a lineup. Peter might have. I don't know if Peter even knows much about where they're at yet. That's probably not put even close to wrapped up yet.
I think it's very early. I don't think I haven't heard anything, so.
Yeah, stay
Okay.
tuned. Yeah.
If they could get Eddie Ciccotti, that's Ghost, that would be great. But,
That'd be great.
If
Yeah.
Jacob Pomrenke could manage that, he would do that.
Jacob Pomrenke has an excellent baseball tour that goes through downtown Chicago. And
Oh,
I
yeah?
hope he does that again.
Huh, that would be interesting.
Yeah, it's really great. Otherwise, I have the handout. I don't have it online digitally. I just have it on paper. But yeah, there are a lot of really notable buildings in history
Yeah.
right near the hotel and the convention. So
I get a quick question. In
Yeah.
Chicago, the teams are, it's common for the team, like one team to be in town, the other to be on the road. How is
Right.
it like in New York when there's 3 teams playing at once?
good question.
Were they like, could you turn on the radio and hear like your choice of New York teams playing at
I'm
home?
sure, you're asking me, right?
Yeah,
When there were 3 teams?
yeah.
What I remember, which was the mid-50s, the Yankees televised about 130 games, meaning their entire home schedule plus road games. This was on Channel 11 PIX in New York. It was free. There was no cable, obviously, so you could really see a lot of games. The Giants were on the same station,
Right.
but they would
Right.
it was only their home
You did
games
every single-
it says
that were on, and the Dodgers televised similar to the
I
Yankees
didn't- oh, wait.
on Channel 9 WOR in New York, and they televised about 120 games or so. Now, the interesting thing obviously was that meant that if the 11 times the Giants played at Ebbets Field, you could see those games, but you had to watch them with Vin Scully because they were on the Dodger pickup. But you could solve that problem by turning the sound down and putting on the radio and listen to Russ Hodgers and I think it was Al Delaney or whatever at the time. So it was very generous television. And one of the first things O'Malley did when he got to Los Angeles was make sure there was no free TV for any Dodger games. I think he had like 11 games a year and they were all from San Francisco. And it was just a way of getting people to come into the ballpark.
Mary, can you hear me?
I can.
Sorry?
Yes,
I was just
Hi,
gonna make a comment if we have the time.
absolutely.
All right, I was just gonna, first of all, Noel, thanks for the book that you sent me.
Well, thanks for being in it.
Well, my pleasure. What I really like best about the book, and there are a lot of good things about it, is the way you handle the minutia behind some of these things, and things that you wouldn't read in the newspaper, for example. An example of that would be the chapter you did on opening day, which was April 15, 1957. And I learned that the President Eisenhower threw out two different first balls, one of which was, it ended up with Neil Chrisley. Neil Chrisley, the former Milwaukee Brave, which is why it appealed to me. And he got the ball, and I know a little about Neil Chrisley because of research I've done on the Braves. And this was his first game in the major leagues. And he got this ball that had been thrown by President Eisenhower. And Chrisley went on to a fairly modest career, let's say. But he made his major league debut that day. He was 1-for-1 as a pinch hitter. And so all these little things kind of fit together with what I find when I look at these different incidents in Braves history in particular. So I think one thing leads to another with these things. I learned that Eisenhower's favorite ball player was Mickey Vernon. Mickey Vernon was also a Milwaukee Brave for a very short time, 59. So anyway, I just want to tell you that I really enjoyed the way you put together all these minutiae, not trivia. These are not trivial, as we all know, but minutiae, I would say. Anyway, congratulations on a really fine book.
Thank you. The minutia, of course, is how what could have been a 250-page book turns into a 357-page book.
Right.
But yeah, I like it. And, you know, people who read history, and, you know, it's a history book, even though it's a sports book, like it also. So, but it's not like I'm going to stop at this point in my life.
Yeah, but I agree with Bob. Yeah. So yeah, I think I don't know how many participants are members of the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association, and I highly advise doing their Facebook page. I don't know, Bob, do you want to mention anything about the event in May, or do you need to wait?
I don't know too much about it.
Okay.
On May 8th, the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association, in conjunction with the Milwaukee Brewers, we're inducting the 20th and final member of the Milwaukee Braves Wall of Honor on the outside of the ballpark. And we're honoring, I think, an appropriate person, Hurricane Hazel. We didn't do Hazel previously. We've inducted 19 people before him. We didn't do Hazel, and actually didn't consider him that much because he was only with the Brewers, of course, or the Braves rather, for 2 months. But in retrospect, I think we should have done this guy sooner. Hazel was the reason that the Braves won the pennant, according to a number of the Braves players. Eddie Matthews said very definitively, I guess, that he didn't think they would have won the pennant without Hazel. So anyway, Hurricane Hazel on May 8th. There will be a short program in the late morning, probably around 11 o'clock, maybe noon, and then there will be tour of the ballpark, and we'll try and get one of Hazel's relatives to throw out the first pitch. So if you know somebody connected with the ball club or with the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association, you might find it interesting. So That's what I know about it.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Looking forward to that. Yeah. Always,
I'm sorry
always
we
are.
couldn't get Mary to do the tour of the ballpark, but
Yeah, I'm sorry I quit.
she's in retirement.
Yeah, if they let me have my swipe access back, I can get us around, or we can go rogue. So,
Yeah.
And if I could add on top of that, we're going to have our next live meeting on May 6th, the Saturday before at J&B's on Blue Mound, our usual stamping grounds. I actually have two minor speakers. I'm trying to get someone bigger. I'm having not a lot of luck, but I'm working on some ideas there. Fortunately, some of the people I'm talking to, I'm trying to get to join us in September or April for a Zoom meeting. They want to go live, so it's working well for me. I'm just working on stuff for March and April. So, but yeah, so May 6th, mark your calendar. So
sounds great, Dennis. So if there are no more questions or comments, we'll release Mr. Hynd. And thank you so much, Noel, and thank you everyone for joining us
Thank
on a Saturday,
Thank you very
NBA
much.
weekend.
I'll
Yeah.
see
Thank you, Mary.
I'll see many of you in Chicago, I hope.
I hope
Yep.
so too. Yeah.
So take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.